Hi, I know we don't normally do this, but I felt it was necessary for this episode. Just even though it's baked into the title that it's the Atlanta child murders, I wanted to make sure to be super clear and upfront from the beginning of this episode that this is an episode that will include multiple murders of children. I've done my absolute best to present the information in a sanitized way to try and hold back my emotions at least until the end of the episode. I definitely do not go into any details beyond cause of death and the manner in which bodies are found. I really did not get into any gory details at all, I promise. But it is some very heavy subject matter. That being said, I think that this is a series of crimes that goes to the very heart of American society, culture, and history. And I think that it's so important to know about it, to look at it, and to, just hold it in our hearts and in our minds just for a moment. So I ask that you bear with me, even though we're going to delve into some very tough stuff today. I understand if you can't, I do, but I urge you to stay with us. Thanks.
Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you killed that guy. It's Knife to Meet You. Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you did that crime. It's Knife to Meet You.
Hello and welcome to Knife to Meet You, the weekly serial killer podcast where each and every week we introduce you to a serial killer that you may not have heard of before. With me as always is Zoe.
Hi.
And I'm Brian, and today Zoe is going to begin telling us about Zoe, tell us about this person.
So the reason that Brian does that, I don't know that I've ever actually explained on air before, is we don't tell each other anything about the case we're researching before the podcast. That way we can still maintain like an unscripted kind of aspect to the show. And I even like to keep my scripts like only bullet points because I don't like it to feel too structured.
I do want to take a brief time out here, listeners. We're actually recording this.
We just started.
Yeah,
we're already taking a time out.
Yeah, it's fine. You don't know about this timeout.
Okay.
It's May 31st, 2021 as we're recording this, which means that Knife to Meet You has actually been a podcast in existence for one whole month now. And just today, we crossed our 100th download threshold.
Oh my god, we did!
Yes.
Oh my god!
Which means that episodes of Knife to Meet You have been listened to 100 times in just the month of May alone, and I just want to say, from me and Zoe and Lobo, like, thank you guys so much for listening to the show.
Why would you
sharing
do this
it with
to me
people.
on air? I'm crying! Oh my god! Oh wow!
Yeah, it's really exciting.
Oh, I know that this isn't actually going to go up for like... Oh wow. No, because we're 3 months ahead. Remember?
Oh, you're right. We're very ahead.
Yeah, I think you should cut this and put it in the next episode, the ACM Part 1.
Okay.
Oh my god. Oh wow. 100.
100.
Oh wow.
Yes. We got that triple digits in 31 days.
I didn't think anyone was going to listen to this podcast.
Well, we have listeners from all over the world. We have listeners in Ireland, Moldova, Greece. We just got our first Canadian listener just today. Hi, Canadian listener. Thanks for listening. Sorry about all the accents we're going to do at some point.
I think you mean sorry about all the accents we're gonna do. She says while wiping tears. Oh my god. Never too emotional to be corny. Wow, thank you guys so much. I'm just so happy to be here. I'm just so happy to be doing this. And I'm just so happy that I can finally tell my mother that people don't want me to shut up.
Oh, like a spiritual victory.
It
That's
is. Yeah, we're having a victory of the heart.
right, exactly.
Which also is going to be the next KTMY musical album. Okay. Today's episode may end up being a two-parter, depending on how long it takes me to get through everything, because today I'm going to tackle a case that I've been obsessed with for a very long time, that only recently got the level of media attention that I believe it deserved. Unfortunately, this media attention only came at the 40-year anniversary of these events. Today, I'm going to tell you all about the Atlanta child murders.
Oh.
So this is a little different from our typical episode structure in two ways. Rather than introducing you to a specific killer who committed a series of solved murders and profiling that person, I will be introducing you to a series of unsolved murders and profiling all of the potential theories as to their culprit. This means there's a lot more ground to cover, and especially means more forensics than psychology, and as we continue, it will become clear why this is. So until around 2019, the Atlanta child murders were pretty unheard of as a case, unless you grew up in that area. The only reason that I knew about them was because of my own obsessive interest in the invention and development of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which has since got its own TV show called Mindhunter, which I believe came out in 2019, where many people learned about the Atlanta child murders for the first time. So for me, it was something that I had really only read about in books until last year, and I was excited to see how the show presented the information. For the record, I think they did a terrific job of giving the survivors a real voice and shining some light on the case and making it feel very real. But given how little time they had to convey the facts, I wasn't surprised by its oversimplification of the case. In fact, the case is so dynamic that it could sustain its own podcast, and has. There's a 2019 podcast called Atlanta Monster, if you'd like an even deeper dive on the case. I haven't actually listened to it myself because, in part, I knew I kind of wanted to do our own episode, and I don't want their podcast to influence my podcast in any way. But you should know that the FBI's archive has a 24-part file that you can read. It's got PDF. Each part is over 150 pages.
Wow.
That's just what the FBI has. Okay, and they were not the only ones investigating.
Right.
So there's just a lot here. I'm obviously not going to cover all of it, but I'm going to do my very best. My introduction is read from a 2019 New York Times article by Audra D.S. Birch. 40 years ago, Atlanta was terrorized by a serial killer who snatched and killed 24 children aged 7 to 17. Sam Pollard and Mero Chermayeff, who made the 5-part HBO docuseries Atlanta's Missing and Murdered Lost Children, Atlanta itself is described as an evolving character. Pollard said, "You see Atlanta struggle with this. They have a black administration, and they struggle with finding some way to solve the crime. After 2 years of having young people die week after week, they had to find someone to say, this is the person who's done it, we've got to wrap this up. The city of Atlanta was exhausted, emotionally and psychologically, and they had to close these cases." Chermayeff adds, obviously, Atlanta was very invested in becoming a world city. They were building the airport, they were beginning to court the Olympics, and the narrator says, yes, and attracting all of these national big companies to come and headquarter there. Chermayeff, exactly. So to have that be a city where a child is getting murdered every week, Pollard, was not going to work. Chermayeff, they were under enormous pressure.
No, that's a really good point, because at that time, you have Coca-Cola looking to expand
Cox
their
Communications,
operations.
yep.
Ted Turner, at that point, is very heavily invested in Georgia and Atlanta, especially. The Turner TBC was based out of Atlanta.
Yeah.
Because there was because when he acquired Warner, it was this thing, because Bugs, they were like Brooklynites and Californians, and now it was being beamed out of the South. Sorry.
There was also a hugely evolving music scene. at
yeah.
the time as well, which eventually became like a huge portion, like the entertainment industry in Georgia is now huge.
Oh yeah,
Film especially right now.
Yeah.
Georgia's film industry is booming.
Yeah, shout out to The Walking Dead. I love that you just knew all of that without having done any prior research. You just have this wealth of knowledge. In a crime library article by Rachel Bell, she says, for Jackson, and here she's referring to Maynard Jackson, the mayor,
Okay.
keeping a power balancing act between his black constituency and the existing white power structure was critical. Otherwise, the white power structure would flee to the suburbs, leaving the city with a much diminished tax base. Bernard Headley, in his book, The Atlanta Youth Murders and the Politics of Race, says, quote, inevitably, many of the balancing acts that Maynard Jackson was forced to perform with Atlanta's white power structure were seen as by blacks as betrayal. So throughout much of Jackson's second term, a context of racial strain persisted. Despite the strong economic growth, the black population of the city remained very poor. Not surprisingly, a serious crime problem developed that made Atlanta one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Atlanta's business community was alarmed at the spiraling crime rate, fearful that businesses would flee the city and conventions would find safer cities for their meetings. I just want to add, not mentioned in Bell's article, that at that time in 1979, Atlanta was the murder capital of the United States with over 240 murders per year.
Wow.
Yes. The article continues that in a 4-month period, 2 very high-profile street murders of blacks by whites would crystallize their fears. In June of 1979, a young white doctor attending one of the city's conventions was murdered by 2 black robbers. And then in October of 1979, a mentally unstable black man gunned down a white legal secretary on her birthday.
Oh.
Everyone was outraged, and the media demanded a crackdown on crime. So it was just to set the scene for what is about to happen, the racial tensions, the context of the legal system, of the evolution of Atlanta. There's so many mechanics at work here going on simultaneously.
Absolutely. It's a powder keg before any of this
Absolutely.
begins.
Yes. In true crime cases with a large body count, it can be really easy to see the victims as just a list. And a lot of the sources of information that I found on the murders themselves presented the information that way. Even in the interview that I quoted earlier with the HBO filmmakers, Chermayeff said that everything I saw was just kind of, this child was died, and this child died, and then this child who was 14th here, and the 15th. And it's a much deeper, much more nuanced story.
Mm-hmm.
I really want this podcast to focus on humanizing these victims as much as possible, on humanizing all victims of true crime as much as possible, and to discuss as much forensic evidence from the crime scenes as possible. Of all the source information that I looked over, Rachel Bell's Crime Library article offered most in-depth and sensitive presentation of facts regarding the killings themselves. And so my description of these events are largely read from her article or paraphrased. You can read the article in full on Murderpedia, which I recommend you do. It's very well written, extremely thorough. It included a lot of information that I hadn't even read before. It feels weird to read someone else's accumulation of facts and information rather than my own, as I typically do. But I felt that she offered so much more to the story than I could if I just kind of summarized a lot of the things that I happened to know or are based off of just a list accumulated from different events. I felt like she gave it a bit of a narrative. And so I would like to read you some more of her article, as I read some more about the context of Atlanta.
Absolutely.
14-year-old Edward Hope Smith lived in one of Atlanta's lower-income housing projects on Cape Street in southwest Atlanta. It was a destitute place that many had the misfortune of living, and few had the means to escape, even though Edward had tried. It isn't difficult to understand why anyone would want to run away from such a disheartening place where more garbage filled the streets than people. Just after midnight in the early morning of July 21st, 1979, Edward left a skating rink where he spent the evening with his girlfriend and began the long walk home. Several days later, his friend, 14-year-old Alfred Evans, who lived on the other side of town off of Memorial Drive in the East Lake Meadows housing projects, left home to see a karate movie in downtown Atlanta. Both boys were very athletic. Smith was a football fanatic, and Evans was equally exuberant about basketball, professional wrestling, boxing, and karate. Smith was trained to play on the high school football team in the fall, and Evans played basketball and boxed. These boys had promise despite their disadvantaged status. They had dreams that they were enthusiastically pursuing. Edward never got home from the skating rink that morning, and Alfred didn't make it to the karate movie. Instead, both of them were found July 28th in a wooded area off of Niskey Lake Road in the southwestern part of the city. Edward had been killed with a .22 caliber gun, and Alfred by an undetermined means. The medical examiner guessed at asphyxia, possibly resulting from strangulation. Both boys were dressed in black, but Edward's socks and distinctive football shirt were missing. Alfred was wearing a belt that wasn't his. Edward was easily identified with dental records, but Alfred's identification is still up for debate today. What happened? Police determined that both boys had at least some involvement with drugs and were possibly together at a pot party. One caller claimed that Alfred shot Edward and a third boy strangled Alfred in a fit of rage. These stories did not work well with the difference of days between their disappearance, nor did the caller ever show up to make a formal statement to police. Well, that's all the police needed to hear. Black boys involved with drugs. Sad, but it happens. Further investigation was very limited.
Naturally, yeah.
And I want to say that that's something thematically that we're going to see a lot here. While the police may have been able to get away with dismissing the deaths of Smith and Evans as drug-related, it was certainly not the case with 14-year-old Milton Harvey. His parents had extricated Milton from the high-risk projects years ago and moved him to a pleasant middle-class neighborhood. That was so weird. Neighborhood in northwest Atlanta. He didn't go to school on the first day of the session because his mother had inadvertently bought him the wrong kind of sneakers and he couldn't face the embarrassment. That day, September 4th of 1979, Milton borrowed a bike and took a check to the bank to pay a credit card bill for his mother. He disappeared along with the bicycle, which was found a week later on a deserted dirt lane named Sandy Creek Road. Milton's badly decomposed remains were found in mid-November in a rubbish dump off of Red Wine Road in the suburb of East Point, a jurisdiction outside of Atlanta's city limits and many miles from the bicycle and Milton's home. His death was not at first considered a homicide since there were no marks of violence on the skeletal remains. A few weeks before Milton's remains were found, Yusuf Bell, an extremely gifted 9-year-old boy, disappeared on his way to the store to buy tobacco snuff for a neighbor. After buying the snuff, a woman thought she saw him get into a blue car with a man she believed was the former husband of Yusuf's mother, Camille. The police later discounted this sighting. Unlike the earlier 3 cases, Yusuf's disappearance received some media attention as Camille begged the abductor to release her well-loved boy. Her community was rallying around her emotional support. Camille's hopes vanished when a school custodian in the abandoned E.P. Johnson Elementary School discovered Yusuf's body on November 8th. He had been wedged into a concrete hole in the floor.
Oh.
He had been strangled to death, either by hand or ligature. The boy had been barefoot when he disappeared and was still barefoot when he was found, but the bottoms of his feet had been washed clean. This case had finally captured the attention of the community at large. Yusuf's funeral was a major event. City officials, black leaders, and politicians of every color fell all over themselves to give their condolences to Camille and mourn the tragic death of this promising young man. Mayor Jackson promised a full investigation, but none of the 4 murders were considered connected until then, just random acts of violence that happen in poor black neighborhoods. Camille Bell and her friends didn't buy that story and realized that these murders were not typical. They continued to articulate their displeasure at the efforts of the police and the city administration, which they considered too distant from its black constituency. Along with this vocal displeasure crept in the fear that the murders were racially motivated and that the Ku Klux Klan was behind it. The police got some breathing room in the last of November and early March. In March of 1980, the killing of black children and youths began in earnest. The lull came to a nasty end on March 4th, 1980, when 12-year-old Angel Lanier finished her homework and left her apartment in southwest Atlanta. When she didn't come home for her favorite television show, her mother, Venus Taylor, called the police. As Angel was approaching puberty, her mother worried more and more. Their home was near Fort McPherson, and men were starting to take an interest in Angel. Venus Taylor's worst fears were confirmed on March 10th when the police found Angel's body tied to a tree with an electrical cord around her neck and a pair of panties that did not belong to Angel stuffed into her mouth.
Oh my god.
Cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation with the electrical cord. Although Angel's hymen had been broken and there were some minor abrasions in the genital area, the medical examiner did not interpret those facts to mean evidence of sexual assault. Those findings became controversial and did not mean that Angel was not the victim of some sexual assault. To me, that seems pretty fucking clear-cut, but, medical examiner in the 1980s, probably a white dude. So this case was particularly different than all of the previous cases in that the victim was female, her body was found under different circumstances than the other male victims, and there were 2 initial suspects who were eventually cleared of the murder. The very next day after Angel's body was found, Jeffrey Mathis, aged 10, had left his home to buy cigarettes for his mother in the early evening. Like Yusuf Bell, Jeffrey would never return from his errand, which was gone over an hour, and sent her other sons to look for him. Later that night, a patrolman told Mrs. Mathis to call the Missing Persons Department if he did not come home by morning. What she did not immediately understand when she contacted that department the next day is that the Missing Persons Department at that time in the Atlanta Police Department and in many major cities did very little to investigate the disappearance of young people. It was assumed that children and teenagers were runaways and not the victims of foul play.
Yeah, that's always very strange to me. Growing up in the 90s, there was an overwhelming fear of, child abduction, and it was on the news all the time when I was a kid. I can remember,
Yeah, that's when the stranger danger movement kind of really started kicking into gear.
Yeah, and it's like you have all this, you have the war on drugs, you obviously have, what was going on at the same time in New York with Giuliani cleaning up Times Square and quote-unquote cleaning up Times Square, and that sort of thing. And people were just like, nah, 14-year-olds just run away all the time. That's just what happens. They just run away and then they're gone.
Yeah.
It's given the time that we grew up, that's because we've seen this more than a few times in cases that we've looked at, you and I, but it never ceases to amaze me that they'll turn up. Like, that was the prevailing attitude for 14-year-olds.
And it's a double-edged sword, too, because I've also seen people say, well, adults are perfectly legally allowed. They're within their rights to disappear whenever they like, If they want to go start a new life in Kokomo, they can do that. So it's like, you can't fucking win. If you're missing someone and you suspect them, foul play, and that this isn't a person who would just take off, if they're a kid, they're a runaway. If they're an adult, they left of their own volition and have a legal right to do so. And police are just like, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah. It's like, we'll keep a lookout for him. Let me put that in my Rolodex with the other 800 people I'm supposed to be looking out for. What?
Yeah, especially in major cities. And especially in the murder capital when they feel like they have so much more important stuff to be worrying about, you know?
In a city as big as Atlanta, not only by population density, but also just by sheer, how much area there is to cover. I can't even imagine that attempting to work in law enforcement in a place of that size. That's just daunting, just even thinking about it. I don't like driving through Atlanta. I don't like having a changeover at the Atlanta airport. I wouldn't want to be responsible for crime and punishment.
Yeah, well, that's just because the Atlanta airport is the most convoluted. Like, ugh.
I'm pretty sure it was built on the remains of something that shouldn't have been built on top of. There's something there. There's something there that you walked. You think you're at gate A, and then you turn around and suddenly you're at gate G. I feel like there's miniature wormholes inside the Atlanta airport, and 3 of them just always lead to Sparrow and Orange Julius.
You say that like that's a bad thing.
I never have
Wormhole to Sparrow.
Look, Sparrow's fine. I don't like big oversized pizza very much, and Orange Julius never makes my drink right.
Jeffrey had last been seen by a friend getting into the back seat of a blue car, possibly a Buick. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge here that. So you'll recall when Yusuf Bell went missing, a woman thought she saw him get into a blue car with a man she believed was the former husband of Yusuf's mother, Camille, and that the police basically, for whatever reason, decided that this was not like a credible witness statement.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the second time someone has mentioned a blue car, now specified to be possibly a Buick.
Mm-hmm.
So, 13 days after Jeffrey Mathis had gone missing, Willie Turner, who had recognized Mathis's picture from the newspaper, claimed that he saw Jeffrey in a blue Nova car driven by a white adult man. Willie Turner also told police that the man he had seen with Mathis had later in the week pulled a gun on him before taking off in his car. Police did little to nothing in response to this information. The report was filed away and essentially forgotten.
Naturally.
The blue car that was earlier seen by Mathis's friend in connection with Jeffrey's disappearance was very similar to the description of a car seen by an eyewitness in a later disappearance of a boy named Aaron Witch. Jeffrey Mathis's 2 brothers had also reported seeing a blue Buick in the driveway of a house that Jeffrey frequented. Interestingly, shortly after Mathis's disappearance, boys from his school had complained to their principal that 2 black men in a blue car had attempted to lure them away from the schoolyard. The youngsters had memorized the license plate and reported it to police, and once again, police didn't do shit.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it's like very clear, which like from the parts of the reading that are like really eloquent and well put, that's all Rachel Bell, and then the parts where I'm like, they didn't do shit, it's all me. All hopefully you can tell where I'm reading and where I'm paraphrasing.
No, you've got it printed out, and then in the margins in red ballpoint pen it says they didn't do shit at the bottom of every paragraph.
Yeah. Eric Middlebrooks, 14, got a phone call around 10:30 p.m. Sunday night, May 18th, 1980. He immediately grabbed his tools and told his foster mother that he was going out to repair his bike. Early the next morning, his body was found a few blocks away. His bicycle was nearby. Eric had been bludgeoned to death. As police looked into this murder, it was suspected that Eric had been an eyewitness to a robbery and that the robbery suspects were also the murder suspects. They didn't have any proof of that, though. But I would like to say that the bludgeoning is obviously not consistent with the clear pattern of asphyxiation, strangulation murders, aside from the very first murder, which was a shooting.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also, do they know what he was bludgeoned with?
It doesn't say.
Okay, because when my first thought was it was his bike. Like, that was my first thought. I was like, oh,
one of his tools, you know?
Oh, true, yeah, big ball.
One of the weapons in the game Clue is a wrench, let me tell you.
It's true.
Especially in the 80s. As we continue, I will have more specifics as to the utter and complete and pervasive incompetence of the Atlanta Police Department as they handle the evidence at crime scenes. It is infuriating to me. But I digress. When I say we don't have that information, it is likely because the police just did not bother to write it down or something ridiculous like that.
You mean I gotta do paperwork?
Just outside the city limits of Atlanta, in Decatur, 12-year-old Christopher Richardson lived in a nice middle-class neighborhood with his grandparents and his mother. In the early afternoon of June 9th, 1980, Christopher went to a local rec center to swim. He never got there. A few weeks later, in the early morning of June 22nd, an amazing crime occurred. 7-year-old LaTanya Wilson was abducted from her home. A neighbor claimed that he saw a black man remove the window pane in the Wilsons' apartment, climb into the apartment, and then leave with the little girl in his arms. Chet Dettlinger, in his book The List, describes how difficult it would have been to do what the neighbor claimed she saw. Quote, if, as the neighbor said, the kidnapper climbed through that window, he stepped squarely onto a bed where 2 other Wilson children were sleeping on. Neither woke up. Once inside, he stole LaTanya from her bed, carrying her past the door of her parents' room. He walked out the back door, leaving it ajar. Outside, he is said to have paused in the parking lot to speak to another black male, all the while holding the limp figure of LaTanya Wilson sleeping under his right arm. Whoever was responsible for these murders and disappearances was approaching a record in the history of crime. What the citizens of Atlanta, the city government, and eventually the FBI didn't realize that it was just the beginning. What Bernard Headley aptly named, quote, a summer of death was just beginning.
Okay. So, I wanna just circle back to this neighbor real quick.
She's not named.
Okay, so this neighbor,
Of the Wilsons.
yes, the Wilsons' neighbor, she said that she saw this person remove the window pane.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. That's ludicrous itself. Okay.
Dettlinger's description of the ludicrousness of her statement is, okay.
I mean, obviously it gets worse. Like, he has to step on the bed.
I'd like to take a minute to talk to you about Dettlinger.
Okay.
So Dettlinger was an ex-police officer, a public safety commissioner, and consultant for the U.S. Justice Department, and he led a voluntary investigation into the Atlanta murders beginning from 1980 and then continuing until another event later on, which we will get to. Dettlinger volunteered his services first to the police, who refused him, and later to the mothers of the victims, who accepted his help to try and put an end to the murders. Dettlinger teamed up with Dick Arena, an ex-crime analyst, and private investigators Bill Taylor and Mike Edwards, along with the help of other volunteers, to assist in the investigation. Dettlinger and his group of volunteers completed much of the legwork that the police didn't do, including going door to door in the neighborhoods where victims lived and disappeared, asking questions and seeking out leads and connections into the murders. What Dettlinger discovered was a definite pattern, including all of the victims on the list of victims, and many victims who never made the list of victims. There's actually something called the list. Dettlinger's findings were significant in that they recognized a social and geographic pattern between the victims. During the peak of the Atlanta murders, he was able to predict with a degree of accuracy where victims would disappear and where they would be found. Task force agents and police who refused to acknowledge any connections among these cases, either geographic or social, at one point suspected Dettlinger himself in the murders. He was quickly released when authorities realized that the information and knowledge Dettlinger had, and which they lacked, came from their own incompetence, misassimilation of information, and mismanagement with the handling of the investigation. The FBI later used Detlinger as an expert consultant, realizing that he knew more vital facts concerning the investigation than the Atlanta Police Department. Okay, that's how monumentally the Atlanta Police Department bungled these murders. And it's not like they didn't have a whole bunch of fucking chances. There's 30 crime scenes here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's so far. I don't know if it's fair to say bungled. Bungle implies that they tried.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It seems like Detlinger had a group of how many volunteers do we know? Maybe a dozen?
It doesn't just say, it just says a group of volunteers.
Okay.
But, well, it's easy to say there's a handful of professionals who have done this.
Fewer volunteers than there are police officers in Atlanta. Most likely. And he was so good at figuring out things about the case they suspected him. That's how incompetent, again, not incompetent, because incompetent would imply that they're trying. How just...
Right. I'm actually going to pause in the section of Belle's article where she talks about Detlinger and his investigation and go back up to where we were right after Bernard Headley's saying it's, Summer of Death, and talk about Stop. Okay. So the cumulative ineffectiveness of the Atlanta police to solve the growing number of missing and murdered children galvanized 3 of the victims' mothers, Camille Bell, Willie Mae Mathis, and Venus Taylor, to join with Reverend Earl Carroll to form the Committee to Stop Children's Murders, which was referred to collectively as STOP. Mm-hmm. The group pressured both the Atlanta city government and sought support from the white corporate power structure. The group was formed none too soon because the day after LaTanya Wilson's shocking abduction, 10-year-old Aaron Witch disappeared. The next day, his body was found beneath a 6-lane highway bridge that passed over railroad tracks in DeKalb County. His death was caused by asphyxia, and the medical examiner, because he landed in a way that prevented him from breathing. What? His death was caused by asphyxia, said the medical examiner.
He landed in a way
that prevented him from breathing.
Okay, so, okay. Here's the one scenario.
Hold on. This death was not initially considered a homicide, even though Aaron was deathly afraid of heights and would not have voluntarily climbed that trestle unless he was running away from someone. The assumption was that Aaron fell off the bridge, despite the fact that the guardrails on the bridge were almost as high as Aaron himself was. Detlinger says, there is no way Aaron Witch could have fallen off that bridge. Jumped or been thrown, maybe, but fall off? No way.
Yeah, I was going to say, okay, he fell in such a way that it cut off his ability to breathe. The only way I can imagine that happening is if it... Did he fall perfectly into a horseshoe? That's cartoon logic. This keeps coming up where so many of the assumptions that were being made by police, 50, 40 years ago, are cartoonishly inept. Not even by today's standards, but just by good sense.
I really can't get into ranting about it because I will unravel. I will unhinge my jaw and swallow these people.
Well.
I just... Okay. I've been trying not to lean too hard on the fact that these are all children.
Mm-hmm.
But I just... LaTanya Wilson was 7.
Yeah. Kids are, basketball players, football players.
Doesn't sound older than they really are. A lot of them weren't really old enough playing high school sports.
Oh yeah. Oh no, but I mean, you're talking about the one kid who he liked basketball and professional wrestling, and I'm thinking
karate.
Yeah, karate movies, and you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about things from that time, like we're not that old, but like I'm thinking about like professional wrestling in 1980, and like Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant, and it's just, and it's like they're it's yeah, and yeah.
Oh God. Sorry, I promised myself that I was not gonna. I had to just get through the all right. Okay. July 6th, 9-year-old Anthony Carter was out playing hide and seek with his cousin after 1 a.m. in the morning when he vanished. First of all, who the fuck lets their 9-year-old play hide and seek with their cousin out past 1 a.m.?
I can think of two scenarios where I've done that, but it was always in like, we're in the woods camping, go play. Well, obviously we didn't call it hide and seek because we were big, strong teenage boys, and hide and seek's for babies. We were playing manhunt.
That's also a very like white experience to have. I don't know that ethnic families, certainly not my family, were very like, let's go camping.
Yeah, well, I mean, also, like, it's in Atlanta. It's 1980. Is it just 1980?
Yes, this is 1980.
So we're 1980. We are 5 years away from the Nintendo Entertainment System. Like, these...
I mean, my father went camping all the time, but he was white.
Oh, we went camping. We went camping a ton when I was a kid. I love camping.
Yeah, I think if I had ever suggested to my mother as a child, like if I had, the thought never even occurred to me that it was an option that I could ask my mom, let's go camping, because it just was not a thinkable thing to even occur to me. But I think if I had, my mother would have been like, listen, we already wandered in the desert for 40 years. We don't need to go wandering out in the fucking woods. Like, unnecessary. So he was playing hide and seek with his cousin. He vanishes. And he's found stabbed to death the next day behind a warehouse less than a mile from his home. Anthony Carter's death it's an outlier in our pattern. And I think it's really important that as we go along, we start notating these outliers. LaTanya and Angel are outliers because they are women and because their abduction and cause of death is unique, doesn't fit with the profile. Although Angel did die of ligature strangulation, so it could be argued that despite the fact that none of the other children were found tied to trees with a ligature around their neck, were clearly sexually assaulted, or not so clearly, depending on how good of a medical examiner you are.
Right.
Or aren't.
Yeah.
An argument could be made that she fits this pattern, but I just want to point out, I want to be pointing out patterns, I want to be pointing out deviancies from patterns.
Yeah.
There's a lot at play here.
I've like the deviancies from the patterns are very interesting to me. Because you have a baseline, ligature strangulation, and then it's almost like he's experimenting,
which is actually very common with serial killers. The idea that they only stick to one method of killing and do not deviate is a common misconception. They like to experiment. They like to try new things. We actually talked about this in episode 1, Richard Cottingham, which I know you edited, but you weren't actually there for the recording of. And so a lot of the time with police investigations of serial killers, sometimes they'll say, oh, these two murders can't be related because the cause of death is different. So I don't want to say, oh, these outliers mean they don't fit the pattern, they're not part of it. I just want to say that, like, it's interesting to note these differences.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on board. It tied up with electrical cord, that's very ritualistic to me, almost. The bludgeoning of the bludgeoning of the one boy who was fixing his bike. Again, a deviation this boy was stabbed now.
Anthony Carter, yes.
Anthony Carter was stabbed.
Yeah.
And so it's...
All right, so we've got an existing pattern here. We've got some outliers to that pattern. I'm about to throw a curveball at you.
Okay.
Okay. Throughout the epidemic of murder and missing children, the Atlanta police maintained that these cases were all separate and none of them were connected. The general attitude was that Atlanta in recent history has a high rate of murdered children. However, after the public outcry the publicity from the mothers group Stop was getting, the city government bowed to the political pressure and announced that they were forming a task force in mid-July to focus their investigation efforts. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks later, on July 30th of 1980, 11-year-old Earl Terrell went with some friends to the South Bend Park swimming pool. Earl began to misbehave, and the lifeguard threw him out of the pool. After that, Earl disappeared. Earl's aunt, who lived next door to the pool, got a phone call. Wait, did she live next door? She just says live next door. Pool to Earl? We don't know. Next door to who? Anyway, she gets a phone call saying, I've got Earl, don't call the police. Shortly afterwards, the man, who sounded to her like a white Southerner, called back saying, I've got Earl, he's in Alabama, it will cost you $200 to get him back. I will call back on Friday. This information was brought to us by Detlinger's investigation. According to Detlinger, police learned of a child pornography ring that was operating right across the street from the South Bend Park pool.
Oh, no.
I did want to mention Christopher Richardson, who was the one boy who was killed out in Decatur, who went to go swim at a rec center, and just say that there's like a swimming connection there, although he obviously was outside city limits, and I doubt he went to the same recreation center as the South Bend Park pool. But any connection is a connection that I want to draw attention to.
Yeah, it's any...
I'm not saying what it means, I'm just saying it's there.
Any 2 pinpoints you can put a string between.
Yeah. John David Wilcoxon was convicted when police found thousands of photos of children pornographically displayed. Police dismissed the connection between Wilcoxon and Earl Terrell because the photos were of white boys. But a witness claimed that Earl Terrell had been to Wilcoxon's house several times. Also, there was some disagreement as to whether the photos were actually all white boys or not. They couldn't even agree on what the fuck evidence they had.
I'm just going to say this right now. That is so irrelevant to whether or not this is, Zoe, this hurts.
I know.
This is like, I feel like I'm trying to solve an impossible riddle. Like, how?
I know.
And it's not like they were diverting. It's not like they didn't have, I don't know if they didn't have resources. I don't know, but like, it's not like they weren't aware there was a problem. It's the murder capital of the world. They don't have.
Not the world, the United States.
Well, yeah, that's true. Sorry, that's the jingoism in me. Saying U.S. the U.S. is the world, but the murder capital of the U.S. and they just don't care.
Yeah,
I can't think of any other.
A little bit better at this point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So at this point, LaTanya Wilson had been abducted, and Earl Terrell had potentially abducted, and potentially, theoretically, could have been transported across state lines, right? And kidnapping and transporting a person across state lines comes into the jurisdiction of the FBI. So now, Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson, who had been trying to get the FBI into this case, now he had the proper rationale to formally ask the FBI to come do some proper motherfucking investigating.
Right.
I strongly doubt that's how he phrases to them. That's just editorializing because I am angry.
No, I'm pretty sure it's the court transcripts.
So now the FBI are going to come in, and that is how I learned about this case, was the FBI's involvement in the case. The summer ended with the death of one more child, unfortunately. 13-year-old Clifford Jones had come to visit his grandmother in Atlanta and was found strangled by some unknown ligature on August 20th. His body had been put in a dumpster wearing shorts and underwear that were not.
Okay, so this again goes back to the girl with
a number of them. A number of
the paintings that weren't her own. Yeah. Okay.
And the very first victims, the first two boys, they were missing clothing that they were supposed to have been wearing. Bernard Headley sums up the case against this suspect, quote, 3 youthful witnesses saw the manager go into the rear room with a black boy. One of them said he saw the manager strangle and beat the boy, then carry his body out to the container. 2 polygraph tests were administered to the laundromat owner. He failed both, according to FBI records, even though he admitted that he knew Clifford, and that Clifford was in his laundromat on the evening of August 20th. Medical experts had determined that the time of Clifford's death was between 4 and 6 hours before the discovery of his body, which would have placed the laundromat manager with the boy around the time he was killed. The authorities had not charged the man with anything, however, because they determined that the youth who said he actually saw Clifford Jones being murdered was retarded.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't like the R word, but that's a direct.
Yeah, obviously it's just sprinkle a little bit of ableism on top of this horrible shit stew that they've got for us. Holy moly.
I know. Another witness said that he had seen the man, whom he knew, carry a large object wrapped in plastic and place it by the dumpsters the night before Jones's body was discovered. The large object wrapped in plastic turned out to be the body of Clifford Jones. 2 other witnesses claimed to see the same man, who they had also known, carry an object wrapped in plastic to the dumpster.
Okay. An object, okay. The body. They mean...
The suspect isn't even named. He wasn't charged, he wasn't named. All they did was polygraph tests, and there's so many witnesses. And he admits that the dead boy was in his fucking laundry. Okay. Yep.
They just didn't care.
Okay.
God.
Alright, it's about to get a little worse. So earlier I had mentioned that pressure from the Stop Mother-led group had forced the police to put together an official task force, right?
Yeah, the Stop Childhood Murder Foundation, something
sure.
similar. Yeah, but 3...
it was the Committee to Stop Children's Murders.
Committee to Stop Children's Murders,
yeah.
Known as STOP. It was 3 victims' mothers, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Camille Bell, which is Yusuf Bell's mother.
Mm-hmm.
Willie Mae Mathis, who must be... what's his name?
Milton
Mathis? No. Milton's last name was something else.
Okay.
Jeffrey Mathis.
Jeffrey Mathis, okay.
Yes, with the extra E.
Oh, gotcha.
And
was it LaTanya's mother?
Yes. Yes, Taylor. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we confused the 2 little girls. It was Angel's mother.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
I love that her name was Angel and her mother's name was Venus. Like, they all have really divine names.
Yeah. So Stop mobilizes and gets the police to commit to a task force.
Yeah. They just put enough pressure on them that they're like, all right, I guess we'll get up off our asses and do our fucking jobs.
I guess we'll look into these child murders. Yeah, ridiculous.
All right, brace yourself. So once the official task force was formed, the police then had to decide which cases to include in their investigation. Those specially assigned cases, which represented murders that fit the particular parameters that they decided on, were compiled into a list. The list, capital L, took on a life of its own during the media hype and investigation into the murders and is still the source of controversy. Unfortunately, the list led to more people misunderstanding the facts about the cases than to their understanding them. This was largely due to the inaccurate and incomplete information gathered about each of the victims, which were oftentimes caused by negligence, ignorance, and mismanagement by the authorities. In many instances, reports conflicted with one another, bodies were misidentified, reports were sometimes changed or lost altogether, and crime scenes were destroyed. Moreover, according to the author and investigator Chet Dentlinger, many that should have made the list never did. Of the many hundreds of murders that occurred during the late 1970s and early 1980s, at least 90 of those shared a similar geographic and/or social connection with one another. Connections that would later be ignored by officials in more than 60 of the 90 cases. That's more than 2/3, for those of you doing math, 66%, during the course of the investigation into the murders. The task force unit ignored that more than 60 cases because they failed to meet the parameters that police were continuously changing and because they failed to notice the geographic and social connection between the victims both on and off the list. Yep.
Okay. So I just want to try and simplify this as much as I can because that kind of helps to for me to grasp the level of awful that we're dealing with. So they mobilize them to make a task force. The task force sets its own criteria. The criteria changes all the time. They exclude everything that they don't think fits the criteria that they're not following, but they're also changing it all the time. And the media has access to this list on an ongoing basis?
That I don't know.
Okay.
The media, I don't know. Everything up until the media, you said, was correct, but you left out the fact that the cases that they have, what they're looking at, the information that they're looking at in order to determine whether or not the cases meet these constantly changing parameters is ineffectual. It's like not accurate.
Yeah.
So they are comparing inaccurate file to a set of changing rules to determine which people do and do not get on the list. And more than 60 names never made the list, which could have because they fit similar social and geographical patterns.
The concept of the capital L list just seems like busy work they created for themselves so they wouldn't have to do actual investigation. Because if you spend all of your time... Quick procrastination tip for any of you out there who struggle with procrastination like I do sometimes. If you spend all the time making a list of stuff you're gonna do, you just don't do the stuff. So, if the main component of their investigation is a list, that they're extra not doing anything.
I'm gonna spoil some stuff for you. Later on, we're gonna talk. They did a one. All right.
Okay.
That's a whole other situation, and we haven't even gotten there. And I'm gonna give that its due information. But even after they made the arrest of this person, more than 20 people were murdered, some of which could be made on the list. But they never did because the police stopped adding names to the list after they had their suspect. Some of those who fit the social and geographic parameters recognized by Dentlinger were Cynthia Montgomery, Angela Bacon, Joseph Lee, Faye Yerby, and Stanley Murray. Those are just a few of the many who did not make the list. For example, Faye Yerby, 22 years old, was considered too old to have made the list at the time of her death in January of 1981. She was found almost 9 months after Angel Lanier. Angel, you will recall, had been found tied to a tree. Here it says she was stabbed to death, but earlier in the article it says that she was ligature strangled to death with an electrical cord, which was left tied around her neck. Yearby had also been found bound to a tree in almost the exact same position Angel had been found. Even though her death in many ways resembled that of Angel Lanier, the task force agents refused to acknowledge any link between the cases.
Okay.
Yep.
It's just it just keeps happening.
On September 14th, 1980, 10-year-old Darren Glass vanished. Shortly afterwards, his foster mother received an emergency phone call from someone claiming to be Darren, but when she answered the phone, the line was dead. Police ignored the case, however, because Darren had run away several times before. Black leadership, churches, and community at large were mobilizing along a number of fronts to deal with this crisis. Activities ranged from prayer vigils, safety education programs, and even regular searches for the missing children. The Atlanta government had even gone so far as to bring in psychic Dorothy Allison, who had assisted in some high-profile cases before then. Which honestly, you know what? If you guys can't do it through regular police work, do it. Bring in the fucking psychic. You know, someone call Patricia Arquette, you know? Go medium. Because obviously you're not getting it done any other way and you need all the help you can fucking get.
I mean, in the absence of people doing their job, then yeah, take whoever's willing to try and help.
Yeah, well, Chet Dentlinger was the first to understand that there was a geographic connection to the victims. And a number of the victims knew each other and either lived or were seen where their bodies were found in several key areas of the city.
Right.
And Dentlinger kept trying to explain the unfolding pattern that he was seeing emerge so that the police could concentrate their efforts in those areas. And the police just were like, no, fuck you, buddy. You're not a cop anymore.
Au contraire, mon frère. He still was a detective. The only one in the city of Atlanta, apparently.
What the police were still wrestling with was a case in which there were many different causes of deaths, modus operandi signatures, only a few of which seemed to fit a pattern. Usually a serial killer selects a particular type of target that is either male or female, very rarely both. While the MO can change based upon the killer's experience or opportunity, the signature, according to Robert D. Keppel, is the killer's psychological calling card that he leaves at each crime scene across a spectrum of several murders. For example, when the killer in one particular murder intentionally leaves the victim in a position so that the victim will be found open and displaced, posed physically spread-eagled and vulnerable, or when he savagely beats the victim to a point of overkill and violently rapes her with an iron rod, or like whatever the fucking, thing is.
Yeah.
So part of the problem was the list itself. It was very unlikely that one individual or group of individuals was responsible for all of the murders and disappearances. Comparing the abduction of LaTanya Wilson with the stabbing death of Clifford Jones suggests very different perpetrators. However, at least in some of the cases, it appeared that at least one or possibly several unconnected serial killers were at work. As the murders and disappearances continued relentlessly, various patterns did emerge. They were just ignored. Late in the evening of October 9th, 1980, 12-year-old Charles Stevens had gone missing. He was found murdered the next morning on a hillside. Stevens had died from suffocation from an unknown object. At the crime scene, the evidence had been contaminated by a police officer when he threw a blanket over the corpse of the boy. The fibers from the blanket were mixed with the fibers already at the scene, and the fibers found were thought to have come from the red interior of a Ford LTD. A drug dealer went to police a day after Stevens' body was discovered. He told the police that on the same day that Charles Stevens disappeared, he had gotten into the car of a client to sell him drugs. When the drug dealer looked in the backseat of the car, he saw a young boy lying lifeless with his head turned towards the trunk, wrapped in a sheet. When the drug dealer asked about the boy, the driver of the car became angry and told him that the boy was merely doped up and passed out. The drug dealer stated to police that he was concerned about the boy because he didn't look doped up, but worse off, possibly dead. The driver of the car told the dealer to forget what he saw. He later threatened the dealer with his life if he said anything about the boy in the back seat. It was then that the dealer went to police and told them the story. He added that he knew the man to be a pedophile and had on occasions been offered money to find the driver young boys with whom he could have sex.
Oh my god.
Yep. Yep.
And I mean, like, you know, the guy, obviously the guy's a drug dealer. He can't go to the cops and say, hey, by the way, one of the guys I deal illegal drugs to is a fucking Pete.
I mean, did you hear about the case? I think it was like in 2019 or 2018 or something like that, where a guy had broken into a family home to steal, like to burgle them.
Mm-hmm.
And he found child pornography on the computer, and he called the police and turned himself in because it was more important that this child, pedophile,
I did
got
hear
off the
about
street.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Robin Hood shit right there. Good for that guy.
Right?
This drug deal.
Chaotic good.
Oh, absolutely. Hard line chaotic good.
Another thing is that a drug dealer has seen some shit.
Oh, yeah.
Drug dealers are around a lot of people who do drugs. I know that will come as a shock to you.
No, listen to me. Hold on.
Yeah. When a drug dealer says
like,
that
kid's not high, you trust
when a drug dealer looks at someone and says, that doesn't look like a high kid to me, that man, to me, is like
he's a subject matter expert.
Yes! Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
I did just do finger guns at you, by the way. That's exactly what I was trying to say. He is a subject matter expert. And his testimony on the matter of whether or not a boy is just doped up and passed out is really integral. And the fact that he was so certain about his assessment of that situation and so disturbed by what he saw that he, as a drug dealer, went to the police.
Yeah.
That speaks so many volumes to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's like so much danger that he put himself, not only himself, but also his community, like everybody he's around. You know,
yep.
the weight of that, but like, no, this guy's not right. He's a wrong un, as the UK people might say.
Yeah. In mid-October, the skeletal remains of Latonia Wilson were finally found in northwest Atlanta, not too far from her home.
Ugh.
It was impossible to determine cause of death or whether she had been sexually abused given the state of her body's composition. During the fall of 1980, the mayor of Atlanta issued a citywide curfew. It was feared that the killer or killers would strike during Halloween, possibly targeting trick-or-treaters. Which is one of the saddest things. That really, I don't know why that got me, but every time I read that, it's just...
Because Halloween is it's the one holiday that is just for kids, like, ostensibly. Like, it is...
Halloween is for everybody, and I just want to put that out there.
Oh, I agree, but I like, on a cultural zeitgeist level, like,
yeah.
Halloween is about kids going out, having fun, trick-or-treating, and teenagers throwing eggs and toilet paper at the houses of teachers they don't like. That's our American gestalt when it comes to Halloween, and so it's like, the fact that Halloween was canceled because of a person murdering children is...
I don't know that we should limit ourselves to a person.
To a string of children being murdered.
Yeah. City patrols were stepped up in an effort to prevent another murder, but unfortunately all attempts failed. Another body was discovered in the first week of November. 9-year-old Aaron Jackson, who was a friend of earlier victim Aaron Witch, was found dead beneath a bridge in the South River in November of 1980, close to where Witch's body had been discovered. Jackson's cause of death was documented as probable asphyxia. Like Charles Stevens, it was believed that Aaron Jackson had been smothered. At about the time Jackson was thought to have been killed, a woman had witnessed a man at the scene where the body was later discovered. The woman reported that she had been to the task force, who in turn failed to respond to the report. However, that was not the only error made by police concerning this case. Throughout the investigation, details would be consistently confused with the details concerning Jackson's friend Aaron Witch. It seemed that the cause of the confusion stemmed from the fact that the boys were very good friends and shared the same first names. Aaron Jackson was later connected with Patman Rogers, with whom he and Witch were friends and neighbors. At one time, Patman had a crush on Jackson's sister. Patrick Patman Rogers was the next child to go missing. He was 16 years old and a karate fanatic and a singer. He was often spotted at Bruce Lee movies or singing with his friend Junior Harper. He had known many people within his neighborhood, and he was connected to at least 17 murdered victims, both on and off the list.
Wow.
Rogers had disappeared on November 10th. He, like other victims, including Darren Glass, was thought to have run away. Therefore, he was not added to the list for quite some time. A week before his disappearance, he had told his mother that he had feared that the killer was close. His friend's mother told police that Rogers was looking for her son to tell him that he had found someone to manage their singing careers, a man named Wayne Williams. Rogers was found on December 21st, 1980, face down in the Chattahoochee River. He died from a blow to his head. Detlinger and Prue stated in The List, which I believe is the book that they wrote about the Atlanta child murders, that after the death of Jackson, no more preteen little boys were added to the list. The geography changed too. Furthermore, the murders seemed to move away from the center of the city to the outlying suburbs. Luby Geeter disappeared in January of 81. He was 14 years old. Even though he fit all of the parameters required by the authorities at the time to make the list, it took 2 days before the police began their investigation of the crime scene after Geeter's body had been found in February of 81. Geeter's body was extremely decomposed when happened upon by a man walking his dog through the woods. When he was found, he was only wearing his underwear. The medical examiner believed that Luby died from asphyxiation from manual strangulation. Geeter had been connected with 2 white male pedophiles, the child molester connected with earlier victim Earl Lee Terrell, and another unidentified man who would later be connected to list victim William Barrett. An acquaintance of Geeter had seen him with the molester linked with Terrell on several occasions. The convicted child molester that had been linked with Terrell was also never a suspect in the murder case of Geeter.
Obviously, okay. It's hard to be. I don't want to say impartial necessarily, but it's hard to be understanding because we have everything in hindsight. But how nobody?
It wasn't nobody. Getlinger was all on this shit.
Well, nobody in an official capacity.
Yeah.
Because obviously the work that he did was invaluable. The information that this drug dealer and I'm sure many other witnesses provided was invaluable, and that without them, nothing ever would have come to light for certain. But nobody at the city level, at the county level, at the state level, the state police weren't involved at this point.
the federal police were.
Yeah, man.
The feds were investigating. I'm sure the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was involved. Absolutely, they were.
Okay.
This incompetence is at so many different fucking levels that it is staggering.
Like, if the...
But you also have to understand that when they brought in the FBI, the behavioral analysis unit was in its infancy. And so when, John Douglas and Robert Ressler, who were some of the founding members of the BAU and are the FBI agents on which Mindhunter is based, got there, they said immediately that the unidentified subject, the person committing these crimes, was going to be black. Because serial killers very, very rarely cross ethnic lines. They only kill within their own ethnicity. And so the fact that all of the victims were black told the FBI immediately, at least from the behavioral analysis point of view, that the killer too was black.
Also,
and this is a fucking problem because a lot of people thought it was the police doing it or the Ku Klux Klan, and that's a whole other can of beans that we're going to open later on.
Well, there's like three guys, like three people who saw a white man in a blue Buick, and there's one neighbor who saw a black man, somehow, impossibly, luckily, not luckily, I should say, just with impossible precision, kidnapped LaTanya.
I actually have here an interview with John Douglas regarding the Atlanta child murders that I was going to get to later. But he said throughout the whole trial, this is from Vulture, throughout the whole trial, all the months leading up to the apprehension, I would come and go because I had other work. By 1989, not only did I have the Atlanta child killings, but I also had the Tylenol murders. We had the Unabomber case up in Chicago. Then we had other cases, Buffalo's .22 caliber killer. I did the written analysis of the case, and people didn't like it. The FBI had me sit down and do an interview with People magazine. In the interview, I say the suspect is going to be black. I'm back on the case down there. I walk into a task force, and pretty much the entire force was African American. Even the agent in charge of the FBI office, John Glover, was the first African American agent in charge of an FBI office. He wasn't introduced at all in the show. And so I wasn't warmly welcomed. They were afraid I was going to create a race war. I remember walking down to one of the crime scenes and a detective says, "You're Douglas?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I saw your profile. It's a bunch of shit, man." I said, "Fuck you, man. I didn't ask to be here. I just want to go back to Quantico. I got a lot of cases waiting for me back there." To me, the turning point in the case came when a guy called up the police saying that he was the killer. He's using the N-word, giving directions on where we can find another body. I hear the tape and I said, "That's not the killer, but we got to catch him because if we don't, he's going to be bothering the hell out of the investigation." What do? We're going to show how stupid we really are. Lo and behold, the guy calls in, "You dumbasses, I told you to search this side of the street, you searched the other." We traced the call and caught him. What's the significance? Well, that ended up in the newspapers in Atlanta. And who read it? The killer. Within a day or so, we end up with a body on Sigmund Road. Now, for certain, we know that they follow the press. Here they reference that he wanted to put up some crosses for some of the memorials that they were having for the murder victims.
Mm.
And that they did put that in the Mindhunter show. This whole interview is basically framed as about the TV show Mindhunter, but he is talking about the actual case as it relates to the show, which is why I'm kind of editorializing like which parts are relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. I do love the "fuck you, man. I just want to go back to Quantico."
Right?
I love that line. It's like, I don't even want... It's like in Clerks, I wasn't even supposed to be here today.
He also said, "I had several things that I wanted to do. The big Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra concert. I knew the unknown subject was going to be in that audience. So I said, let's look for somebody who has some type of security background who has a vehicle. We can screen them right away. We can get rid of all the females. We'll get rid of all the people who don't have cars. We can eliminate through race." Again, it was a great idea. It wasn't used. We know later on that the person they eventually arrested for the murders was at the concert.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, how could you pass up Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr.? I'm sure that was an incredible show.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to this interview later after we discuss the arrest that was made. But, yeah, I'm obsessed with John Douglas, and he and Robert Ressler are the reason why I know about the Atlanta child murders, and why I knew about it before it became popularized by, HBO and the ID Channel's 3-part series and the Mindhunter show and, all of the things that came about as a result of the 40th anniversary of these. I want to reiterate, I wanted to add that FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood was one of the FBI agents that came down to help when the mayor finally called in the FBI. And 3 Atlanta detectives drove him around the city, and they turned into Jeffrey Mathis's neighborhood. Obviously, Jeffrey being one of the children who was murdered. And what Hazelwood said about that day in an interview was, as soon as we turned onto that street, everything stopped. The guy cutting the grass stopped. The guys playing dominoes on the porch stopped. I said, what's going on? I said, everything stopped. He said laughingly, that's because we have a honky in the car. So he and John Glover, who had taken over FBI chief in Atlanta that summer, decided together that the killer had to be black. Glover said, the killer is someone who is invisible in the black community. And who is invisible in the black community but another black person? So not only was the profile because killers rarely cross racial lines when they kill serial killers, but also because a white person would have been like, neon sign, serial killer, right over here, guys, doesn't belong here. Yeah. So that's another reason why they knew that the killer had to be black.
Oh yeah, no, you'd stick out like a crocodile in alligator world. Crocodiles and alligators are very distinct reptiles, Zoe. They're not all the same.
A couple of things that I said recently. That Patrick Rogers, was connected to at least 17 of the murdered victims, both on and off the list. And that a week before his disappearance, Pat told his mother that he feared the killer was close. Maybe that was Rogers told his mother that. I don't know. The way this is worded is a bit confusing. And I also want to reiterate that his friend's mother told police that Rogers was looking for Pat to tell him that he had found someone to manage their singing careers, and that it was a man named Wayne Williams.
Right.
Okay. You're going to want to remember that name. Terry Pugh was 15 when he disappeared in January of 1981. He had been last seen at a hamburger restaurant on Memorial Drive and was a friend of list victim Lou Begeter, who had gone missing the same month. An anonymous white caller had phoned the police and informed them where they could find Pugh's body. He was found near Interstate 20 on Sigmund Road in Atlanta. He had been strangled by some sort of ligature. The same caller had also indicated that the remains of another victim could be found on the same road. Years later, those remains were finally located but never identified. Some suggested they were the remains of still missing Darren Glass. They were never added to the list, even though Pugh's were. Patrick Baltazar was 11 when he had disappeared on February 6, 1981. A man cleaning up the grounds 1 week after he had gone missing found Baltazar's body in an office park. The boy had been strangled to death, and the rope thought to have been the murder weapon lay close to the body. Before his death, the task force had received a call from the boy saying that he believed the killer was coming after him. Unfortunately, the task force failed to fucking respond. One wonders if Baltazar would still be alive today if they had responded. After Baltazar had gone missing, his teacher had claimed that she received a phone call from a boy she thought to be Baltazar, although the boy never said who he was. He merely cried into the receiver of the phone. That same month, 13-year-old Curtis Walker disappeared and was immediately added to the list. Curtis had lived with his mother and uncle at the Bowen Homes housing project in Atlanta. Both he and his uncle, Stanley Murray, would be murdered. Curtis would make the now infamous list, but his uncle would not. His body was found on March 6th in the South River. His death, like many of the other list victims, would be documented as caused by asphyxia, likely strangulation with a cord or a narrow rope. That same day, FBI agents found the remains of Jeffrey Mathis, who had been missing for almost a year. His funeral was captured on national news. Joseph Jojo Bell, not to be confused with Yusuf Bell, who has a very similar name, was 15 when he disappeared on March 2nd of 81. 2 days after he had gone missing, a coworker of his who worked at a popular seafood restaurant named Captain Peg's told his manager that Jojo had called him and told him he was, quote, almost dead.
Oh my God.
The boy said Jojo had pleaded for his coworker to help him before hanging up the phone. The manager reported the call to the police. Several days later, Jojo's mother received a call from a woman who said she had Jojo. The same woman had called back and spoken with Mrs. Bell's 2 other children. Mrs. Bell immediately called the task force, who never called her back. Frustrated, she contacted the FBI, but it was too late. Jojo was found on April 19th in the South River. His cause of death was probable asphyxia. Jojo was linked to several victims on and off the list. His mother had befriended a fellow inmate while serving time for murdering her husband, which is a whole other interesting story that I'd like to talk about but know nothing about. That woman happened to be the sister of Alfred Evans, who was victim number 2. Jojo had gone to summer camp with Cynthia Montgomery, a murder victim who had not made the list, but could be connected to many victims who had made the list. Jojo was also good friends with Timothy Hill, a very troubled young man with violent tendencies, who disappeared 11 days after Jojo. He and Timothy Hill were known to frequent a house on Gray Street known as Uncle Tom's. A 63-year-old homosexual man named Thomas Terrell was known to have a particular interest in young boys, and he owned the house. Timothy Hill, Jojo's friend, disappeared that same month. Tom Terrell's next-door neighbor saw Timothy the day before he disappeared on March 12th. A young man who had also known Timothy and Tom told police that the two frequently engaged in sex together. Tom would usually pay 13-year-old Timothy for sexual favors. Terrell himself admitted to police that he had engaged in sexual acts with the boy. Another witness reported to the police that Timothy spent the night at Terrell's after missing his bus the day before he was reported missing. That same witness was the last to see Timothy. He claimed that the night before he disappeared, he saw from his window Timothy talking with a teenage girl. Timothy was found on March 30th in the Chattahoochee River. He was the last child victim to be added to the list. His cause of death was also listed as asphyxia. Terrell was never suspected in the disappearance or murder of Timothy or Jojo. He was later linked with Alfred Evans, Jeffrey Mathis, Patrick Balthazar, and Anthony Carter.
I'm assuming he is also related to the ring of pedophiles that they busted across from the community pool.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Because no one's fucking investigating.
Yeah, no kidding.
Throughout the horrible series of murders, the children began to get older. Also, rivers fast became the favored dumping ground for victims. Suddenly, there were no more child victims. Were the safety education programs and curfew finally working, or had the murderers' taste simply matured? That's a good question, but I think it was the fact that it was getting real serious. This had been going on for years, and I think people at this point were starting to be like, because, in watching a lot of documentaries about this, it was made very clear that a lot of the children who were out and about on streets alone were doing so out of necessity to provide for their families.
Yeah.
A lot of these kids ran errands for money. They would go pick up groceries or send messages or get cigarettes or whatever for people in their neighborhood. And that money was instrumental in feeding their families.
Yeah.
So even though they were afraid, they couldn't afford to take their children off the street. And I think eventually the people realized they couldn't afford not to.
Yeah.
So my personal opinion is that the ages of the victims began to increase as the curfew and the citywide panic began to increase.
Yeah, people are agitated. There's more... the police are getting more reports of not only things related to these killings, but also people are more on guard. So there's going to be more coming in. I honestly would not be shocked to see if conviction rates, if not crime rates of other types of crimes, did not fall during this time because of the increased panic. People tend to stay home.
I don't know about that.
No?
I don't know. There's no evidence of that, but there's no evidence that I am aware of.
Pure speculation on my part.
That's okay. Conjecture is welcome here. That same year, residents of a housing project called Techwood Homes took to the streets in protest that the police were not doing their jobs in protecting the public. The group of residents decided to take matters into their own hands, and they formed a bat patrol. The patrol was made up of residents armed with baseball bats, hoping to prevent murders from happening in their community. Sadly, the residents' attempts, much like the authorities' increased patrols, also failed to prevent the murders from occurring. On the exact day that residents had taken up the bat patrol, and in the very housing project in which it was formed, another person named Eddie, also called Bubba Duncan, disappeared. He was the first adult to make the list. 21-year-old Eddie Bubba Duncan disappeared on March 20th and was found out on April 8th. He, like Timothy Hill, had been dumped in the Chattahoochee River. Eddie had several physical and intellectual handicaps. With Duncan's death, the parameters of the list changed to encompass older victims. Before this period, other victims who were young adults were left off the list because they were considered to be too old. Those earlier young adult victims were never added, even after the parameters changed. So even though now they started to include older victims, people that were already dead but had been excluded for being too old were never looked at again.
So they didn't retroactively go back to the maybe pile. Okay.
No, they did not.
Lovely.
The maybe pile was put in like an incinerator or something, and they just never fucking looked at it again.
It was like, that's why we have the maybe pile.
Yes. So those earlier young adult victims were never added, even after the parameters changed. Once again, the medical examiner guessed probable asphyxia was documented. And Eddie Duncan was also connected with another list victim, Patman Rogers. Immense sums of money were offered as rewards to help find the killer or killers at large. Much of the money was donated or raised by corporations and famous figures such as Muhammad Ali, Burt Reynolds, Gladys Knight, and the Pips. In 1981, President Reagan issued more than $2 million to the city of Atlanta and the task force to use toward the investigations and for citizens who needed help in dealing with the stress of the murders. Other monies that were donated and raised were mostly used to help in the investigation as well as to help the families of the list victims. Unfortunately, only a few of the victims' families ever received the money that was raised or donated. The city and nonprofit organizations poorly controlled the money. Much of it fell through the cracks of the system, misplaced, or lost altogether. However, despite the massive flow of money into the city to help put an end to the murders, they still continued.
Hold on, Zoe, I just want to back up for a second, because you've just said something completely unbelievable to me. You're telling me that Ronald Reagan took a large sum of money, gave it to the people at the top in the hopes that it would trickle down, in a sense, and help the people who were actually affected, and that didn't happen? Ronald Reagan? The Gipper?
It's almost as though Ronald Wilson Reagan has no concept of how the economy works at all.
The star of Bedtime for Bonzo? I can't believe that.
I know.
Oh my gosh. This world.
I know. The second adult to make the infamous list was 20-year-old Larry Rogers, no relation to Patrick Rogers. He turned up dead after missing for more than 2 weeks in April, and he was not found in a river like the 3 victims before him, but in an abandoned apartment. His cause of death was documented as probable asphyxia by strangulation. Rogers was developmentally disabled. Rogers was one of the few victims to be connected to Wayne Williams. Supposedly, Williams had hidden the younger brother of Larry Rogers from police. The younger Rogers had been involved in a violent fight in which he suffered a head injury. It was Wayne Williams, in fact, that had taken him to the hospital. Williams overheard on his police scanner news of the fight and had beaten the police to the scene. He picked up the mother of the boys and took her to his apartment where Rogers was. Mrs. Rogers would later testify against Williams at his trial. The apartment that Williams had taken her to was close by to the place where her older son was later found dead. 23-year-old ex-convict Michael McIntosh was last seen on March 25th of 81 by a shop owner who said that the young man had been beaten up. The store owner had said McIntosh told him 2 black men had roughed him up. He was never seen alive again. McIntosh had lived across the street from Captain Peg's seafood restaurant where JoJo had worked. In fact, he had known JoJo Bell. Like JoJo, McIntosh had been known to hang around with homosexuals, and it was believed he was one himself. He had been seen several times at Tom Terrell's house, a house that both JoJo Bell and Timothy Hill had often frequented. McIntosh was pulled from the Chattahoochee River in April. He, too, had died from probable asphyxia, according to the medical examiner. McIntosh had known another list victim named Nathaniel Cater, who would disappear a month later. John Porter, like McIntosh, was an ex-convict. He spent much of his time with his grandmother, whom he lived with on and off. She had kicked him out of the house on several occasions because of his strange behavior. He had been suffering from severe mental problems and had spent a length of time in a mental hospital. He was kicked out shortly before he had disappeared because his grandmother had found him fondling a 2-year-old boy she was caring for in her home. He was 28 when he was found dead in April of 1981. He had been stabbed 6 times and left on a sidewalk in an empty lot. Porter originally did not make the list until the Wayne Williams trial, when he and Williams were linked through fiber matches. 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne had also disappeared the same month as Porter. Police reports stated that his sister last saw Payne the day before his disappearance. He had shared an apartment with his sister and mother. His sister told police that he was on his way to sell old coins at a coin shop. However, Payne's girlfriend had claimed to see him the very day he had supposedly disappeared. She told jurors that he had walked her to the bus stop the morning of April 22nd. She had become worried when he did not pick her up from the bus stop as they had planned to meet there. Payne had been known to suffer bouts of depression, especially during his incarceration while serving a sentence for burglary. Payne at one time had attempted to hang himself with his bedsheets, yet failed to succeed when a social worker found him. He had survived that one brush with death, but would not live for long afterwards. Payne was found a week after his disappearance, floating in the Chattahoochee River. His cause of death was reported as undetermined, according to the county medical examiner. It was believed that he had been in the water almost the entire length of time he had been missing. William Barrett, also known as Billy Starr, was a 17-year-old juvenile delinquent when he had vanished in the May of 1981. He vanished on his way to pay a bill for his mother. The following day, his body was found close to his home. He had been both strangled and stabbed. The medical examiner reported that the stabbing occurred after Billy had died from strangulation. Earlier police reports stated that threats by a quote-unquote hitman had been made against Barrett. Barrett had also been connected to a white man previously convicted of pedophilia. The same man was also said to have known list victim Luby Geeter. A witness had seen Geeter on several occasions at the suspect's apartment, and the same man had been witnessed at Barrett's funeral. Ex-convict Nathaniel Cater was 27 years old when he became the last victim to make the list. He had lived in the same apartment building as LaTanya Wilson. It is unknown as to exactly when Cater had disappeared. What authorities did know was that he was an admitted homosexual prostitute, drug dealer, and alcoholic. And a witness who had known the suspect in the death of Clifford Jones said that Cater admitted to selling himself his blood at the blood bank and dope in exchange for money. So I'm going to jump back to Chet Detlinger now, who first began his map of murder victims in the summer of 1980, who had initially made the list. However, he quickly discovered that there were many that the police had left off the list that were worth examination. Detlinger's list of victims had well outnumbered the task force lists. Several of those victims had first been ignored by the task force agents, such as Aaron Witch and Patrick Rogers, had made Detlinger's list soon after their disappearance. Some of those names were later added by task force agents due to increasing pressure by Detlinger, who was able to provide them with information that they lacked that allowed them to later connect the cases. Detlinger had mapped out the precise location of where the victims had lived, where they had disappeared, and where they had been found. By doing this, he discovered that the victims were connected to Memorial Drive and 11 other major streets centered in that immediate area. Detlinger, after Patrick Rogers' death, that's Patman, the victims that were found were older, and their bodies were disposed of further outside the city limits. However, Detlinger and Prue are quoted in their book, The List, as saying, "The streets didn't change, but it was necessary only to extend the streets on the map, not add new ones. Even those Chattahoochee and South River findings would occur at bridges carrying one of the streets on the map. Therefore, the parameters basically remained the same despite the ages of the victim." So, once they had figured this out, they decided, the FBI, John Douglas, they all decided that they were going to put together a campout overnight of officers at these water drop, because it had become so common for the bodies to be dropped overnight in bodies of water at these roads. They thought it was worthwhile to assemble a team to work shifts monitoring these areas at night in case of a body drop. And
Exactly.
guess what?
They saw a body drop.
Well, I mean, they didn't see it. They heard it, though.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
They witnessed
In the
a
early
body
morning
drop.
hours of Friday, May 22nd, 1981, at the James Jackson Parkway Bridge that crossed over the Chattahoochee River where previous bodies had been found, 2 police officers were staked out at the bridge in an effort to monitor suspicious activities. Officer Freddie Jacobs was stationed on the Fulton County side, or the southern part of the bridge, and Officer Bob Campbell was stationed beneath the bridge at the northerly Cobb County side of the bridge. Officer Jacobs saw the headlights of a car approaching southbound over the bridge, and at about the same time, Officer Campbell heard a car driving over the bridge. Then Campbell heard a splash in the water, and the line that Rachel Bell wrote here is, "It was the splash that had sent ripples around the world and would mark the beginning of one of the most famous trials in recent."
Wow.
According to Campbell, he heard a loud splash, unlike the sound that some of the river animals made when they dove in the water, and noticed ripples in the water made from whatever had landed in the river. He saw a car standing on the bridge. Then the car turned its headlights on above the area where he had heard the splash and had seen the ripples. So he radioed FBI agent Greg Gilliland, who pulled the car over almost a half mile from the bridge. Holden had still been following the car from behind when it was pulled over, and the driver of the station wagon was Wayne Williams. Williams, almost 23 years old, was a freelance photographer and quote-unquote music promoter who said he was traveling across the bridge to find the home of a potential client with whom he had an appointment several hours later. He told the police the woman's name was Cheryl Johnson, and that he intended to audition her with the possibility of promoting her as a singer. However, agents did not believe his story, particularly when the phone number he gave for this Cheryl Johnson was incorrect, and the address that he gave them did not exist. Williams allowed the authorities to search the car. For over an hour, Williams was questioned about what he was doing on the bridge and his reason for being in the area. Several hours later, officers dragged the Chattahoochee River around the bridge, but they found no evidence of a body. The next day, police again questioned Williams and began to realize they were dealing with a most unusual man.
He's 22?
23.
Okay, I heard almost 23. He's 23 years old.
Oh, I guess it is almost 23 years old.
Okay, so this guy's 22.
I just want to say real quick before you say whatever you're about to say. It wasn't mentioned in this article, but I happen to know for a fact that when they pulled him over, they asked him if he knew why they were pulling him over, and he said, "Well, I guess it must have something to do with the death of all those boys."
What?
Unprompted.
Is my tail light out? Like... Oh my god, criminals are so dumb. Wow. Okay, carry on. Sorry. His age really took me by surprise. I did not expect him to be that young. So we're going to wrap up this episode here. Zoe, can you tell us a little bit about what we are in store for next week with Wayne Williams?
So we're going to look a little bit more at the arrest of Wayne Williams, the evidence, his trial, his court trial, and other theories surrounding the killings, since there's a whole plethora of other crap we haven't quite gotten to yet. And we'll be covering all of that in part 2 of our episode on the Atlanta child murders. I'll also do like a little bit of psychology, looking at Wayne Williams there, simply because we do have a lot of information about him and for some other reasons that we'll get into next time. So those of you who really like the armchair psychology will get a little tiny treat.
Well, I can't wait to hear about all of that, and I know our listeners can't either. But until next time, gang, you can go ahead and reach out to us on Twitter at KTMYPod. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/KTMYPodcast, on our very own website at KTMYpodcast.com. And you can always send us an email at ktmypodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, listeners, it's been nice to meet you. Have a great week.